Post 2 on how you're going to get experience before you actually get a data science or machine learning job. How do you learn about this field? How do you prove to a hiring manager that you have all of the capabilities necessary to contribute from day one? That's your independent project portfolio. But how do you pick projects that make you stand out versus projects that make you look like you just have academic knowledge of, instead of capability to actually build, to create some sort of value for a business? How do you do that? Now, in the first post, we talked end to end about how you go through figuring out what a business problem is. What is a real world problem to solve, and how do you make your project connect your model metrics with your business metrics? Now that you understand that, and we talked about the sneaker marketplace, the secondary sneaker market, now let's talk about the next step. Now that we have our business problem, how do we learn about the marketplace to get us ready to start gathering data? And this is, again, it's a continuation of last post where I talked about understanding the business problem. Now we're going to get a better understanding of the system that we're going to measure, because that understanding is going to drive what data do we need to gather in order to model this system. So if you remember from last time, we're trying to increase margins. We're trying to increase margins from a hypothetical 50% to 75% or higher for every sneaker purchase. And we're going to do that by predicting, number one, which sneakers will have high margins, and number two, which sizes of those sneakers will have the highest margin. So that's, you're up to speed. Now let's get to understand a marketplace. Let's get to understand more about the business problem. In the real world, you would sit down with users, you would sit down with experts, you would talk to people who have all of the knowledge you need to start getting an understanding of the domain. But we don't have that. If you're a student, you don't always have access to experts, but you have Google. And I kid you not, you can get an amazing amount of information about any of the marketplaces you might want to simulate, might want to measure, just by Googling it. There's a wealth of information about almost every marketplace. I picked the sneaker marketplace because the information is deep. It's something that's been popular for about a year to write on and to analyze. So there's a wealth of information out there that you can read, and you can pretty quickly get the understanding of this marketplace because it's not very complicated, specifically towards one type of product with multiple brands. Now, how am I going to begin to understand it? Well, now let's look at the first post. Basically, I just Google searched, and no kidding, I'm just grabbing each one of these and saying, okay, what can I learn by reading what people have published about the sneaker market, the secondary sneaker market? Well, it could reach 30 billion by 2030. If I read this post right here, this is going to tell me that the sneaker market is growing. It's not shrinking, it's getting bigger. And if you read through here, they're basically saying this is not a trend. This isn't something that is going to be here today, gone tomorrow. This is a marketplace that has some stability and some legs. And this will give you some basic background on reselling and margins. It's a great post. A couple of minutes, you have some basic background. Let's go to the next one. This is a great graphic for you to look at because you'll figure out where I got that 50% number from. Where did I get that hypothetical 50% from? Right here. If you look at the best-selling brands, the premium above retail that you just on average get, it's about 50% for Nikes and Jordans. So if you were just a regular reseller playing guess and goof, you would probably be getting roughly a 50% return. Now, why would you hire a data scientist? Like I talked about in the last video, you would hire a data scientist to make an improvement in your margins. And so this is where I got that hypothetical number we were talking about in the first video, 50%. Now the change I want to drive is to get that 75% or higher, because that's going to be something interesting to the business. That's something that'll get people interested in, they'll buy in on the project, and they'll actually give you money to do it. So this is where I got that information from. Again, very easy Google search, and I found it. It's right there. Next. Oh, so the coronavirus impacted the secondary sneaker market. Mm. Why is this important to understand? Well, with data gathering, you can have distributions shift. We call this drift if you detect it after the fact. But if you know going in that you're going to have some data that's impacted by COVID, and then the data before that is not going to have the same impact, you realize that there are two different sets of data, and you're going to have to evaluate that data with two different models because that distribution has shifted because of COVID. That's interesting and important to understand. It's a real world factor. We have to deal with drift. We have to take a lot of external function and features of the marketplace into account in order to create a real world project. And when it comes to how do you know, well, you learn about it by reading about the market. And in this post, it tells you a whole lot of detail about what types of shoes charge a premium or gain a premium, and sometimes which shoes fall flat, what shoes don't ever get anywhere. They don't make any sort of improvement, and so you understand the problem's real. The problem of someone buying a pair of shoes expecting them to go up in price and to be able to charge a premium, that doesn't always happen. And in that case, you're stuck with that stock, and you could end up taking a loss when you consider how much it costs for you to buy it, get it to you, and then give it to the reseller. And then the reseller charges a percentage as a fee for the transaction. So they're eating into your margins. Using that marketplace saves you money, but at the same time, it eats into your margins. And so in some cases, you can lose money on a transaction because you didn't get a high enough margin. Now you're understanding more and more of the dynamics of the marketplace. So it's not just I get a 50% margin, I get a 50% margin after all of my costs. Now you understand a little bit more about the features and the dynamics of the marketplace. And you get that again by just reading about the marketplace and beginning to understand some of the dynamics that aren't as obvious to an outsider, to somebody who doesn't do sneaker trading all day. And these are the types of things you need to start noting because they're going to go into the business case and the problem description that you're going to write up to explain exactly why you chose the solution you did. And so all of these factors are things you have to research. You have to get as comprehensive an understanding of the marketplace as possible in order to understand all the features and make sure that your project really takes into account everything that it needs to in order to create accurate predictions and real world impacts, things that are plausible, not things that feel canned and toy. Because in the real world, there are other considerations that aren't obvious. They all stem from the business model. And you have to take that business model into account and explain in the problem statement why you have some constraints based on your business model. And that's always going to be the case. And again, you can get it just by simply reading online and understanding everything from how data drifts and how you're going to have to account for that when you're gathering data to the fundamentals of the business model and marketplace. Now here we have again, same chart. There's going to be a lot of this when you're doing research. There's a whole lot of redundance. This right here is another great post to explain some of the external considerations, some of the limitations, how the market has grown, how the history of the secondary sneaker marketplace has impacted what's happening today. Again, that might indicate that some historical data is stale, so you don't want to go back too far. But again, we have what we've learned about COVID, meaning that we have to go to pre-COVID because now we're getting out of the pandemic. And so the COVID data set is going to be interesting, but it's not going to be widely applicable going forward. But there will be some changes that we bring forward. And again, this is part of our description of the problem space, and this is an important piece of it. And this is talking more about the historical sneaker marketplace. And the further back you go, the more stale the data is, and the less important the trends from 2 years ago are today. So you get some background, you get some history, you understand the players, who are the secondary marketplaces that people sell shoes on. And again, this is great background information. And then finally, you're always going to find one gold in-depth research post. There's always one. This is for sneakerheads. This describes exactly what it's like from a seller's perspective. This would give you an idea of if you sat down and talked to a client who was a reseller of sneakers, they would give you all this background information. This is a lengthy article. It'll take you about 20 or 30 minutes to read and digest, but it explains end to end the sneaker marketplace, how it works, what sellers do, and this is what you want to find because it's going to give you a better understanding of your simulated customer, the customer you're pretending you have, the client you're pretending to have, the employer you're pretending to work with. So this article gives you just that entire understanding of the marketplace. And what you're going to hear in this article is not only the major players, but the logistics side, which are going to be costs that are going to enter into your thought process as you're building the model and simulating the system. But it also explains a lot of the social media aspect of this. And when it comes to drivers, what drives demand in this marketplace, social media is a big part of it. Social media could be one of those places that you want to get data from because people on social media talk about sneakers. The sneakerhead community talks about sneakers and what they're interested in and what they're not interested in. And you can look at the way that we talk about sneakers online and you can draw some correlations between the hype before a sneaker release and the reality of what the premium is over that first month, second month, third month after release. You can look and see if there's some correlations. So now you're hearing me say, okay, if I were gathering data, what data would I gather? Well, you can see in some of these marketplaces, you've got information about the sneakers, the prices, even trends, historical prices and trends over time. So those websites are going to be an invaluable resource of data for you. There are entire marketplaces that track historical prices on shoes. And if you're looking for analysis, it's already pre-made excellent data. So you want that. You want to go out and gather data from those websites. What else? We talked about social media. And again, in this post, they highlight exactly how big of a role social media plays to sellers. And so you want to get on social media and you want to begin to gather data from social media and analyze it to see if any of the trends that you find in social media around a particular shoe correlate with prices after the fact. So that's another set of data that you're going to want to gather. You're going to want to go to social media sites. Number one, figure out which ones have the most active sneakerhead community. And what you'll find is everything from Instagram to TikTok to Reddit have very rich sneakerhead communities. And then there's other social media sites like LinkedIn. Trust me, no one's doing sneaker research on LinkedIn. So there are some pretty obvious, I want to gather social media data from these sites. And then there are other social media sites where you just, no, that's not where sneakerheads are. And so you want to create some sort of tool to analyze social media sites and find out which ones have the largest and most engaged communities. So that's part of your problem space is figuring that out. Part of your problem space is gathering data, historical data about sneaker prices. And so you want to go to those marketplaces, those places that are going to give you all of that information. You're going to build basic scrapers. And you know how to do this. You know how to go and build web scrapers. You know how to attach to social media APIs and pull down data around hashtags. You know how to build out a graph analysis where you essentially graph out the community around each one of those hashtags, who's sharing, whose posts are most engaged with, who are the people who are not sharing but are engaging with those posts, and you create a graph. It's a community graph of all of the players, some who are influencers, those who are getting engagement, who potentially could be driving the secondary market price up for a particular shoe, and who are the people who are interested and engaged. And if you can see what size the community is around each shoe, so now you have the total community, and then you look at the community around a particular shoe or around a particular release, can you find some data points that correlate to a higher resale price? Can you find some correlation between higher margins and that community and the content that's shared, or the quantity of content, or the number of pictures, or the types of pictures? Do generic pictures indicate a shoe that's not going to sell as well as pictures of shoe on foot? What if there are more shoe on foot pictures? Does that correlate to, do users have a preference for, and do they engage more with a brand and with a shoe when that is seen on social media on foot versus here's a generic picture of the shoe? You'll find, yes, there's a correlation there. So any of these types of hypotheses can be formulated by gathering data from, in this case, social media and historical trend pricing data from your secondary reseller sites, and then beginning your more traditional exploratory data analysis, initial model creation that builds out your hypothesis. You sort of tear down your first few models and understand these features appear to be highly correlated with, again, those two things that I'm trying to predict: your margin, your percentage above initial offering price for the shoe, and which shoe size have the highest margin. So you're not only predicting shoe, but also shoe size that I should buy. And there is a very simple exploration of the problem space, and then connecting that problem space to what data can we gather by simply learning more about the market just from a basic Google search. And now you come up with some intuitive, you don't have a whole lot of data, so you have to trust your experts. You come up with some very intuitive places to start gathering data. And you know how to do this. This is more of a traditional data science project where you build out your pipelines, you connect with your social media APIs. There's going to be some constraints. You can't go back very far using most free, openly available APIs to pull posts off of social media. So there are going to be some constraints on it. And you have to put that into basically a feasibility study. Now that you figured out what data that you want to gather, you figured out the constraints on your gathering. How much data can you get? Do you have some hardware constraints? Obviously, you're not working with a massive budget, so you're not analyzing Twitter's fire hose. You have to constrain the number of tweets or the number of Instagram posts or TikTok videos that you analyze. You may not have the ability to do image recognition where you can find that shoe in a picture. That might be something that you need to build out, and you can only build to a certain level of accuracy because you only have a certain amount of training data, and not all of that is going to be labeled well enough to allow you to recognize a shoe on foot. That could be a constraint. And you get through all of this, and you now have a feasibility study. How feasible is this project going to be for you to do? A lot of projects die right here. You may find out that you can't build the APIs that, or you can't access the APIs that you need because there's too much data, or some of them are closed off, or you can't get the information from the API for free. You may find out you have storage issues that, especially when you're pulling down videos and you're doing analysis on videos and analysis on images, you have limitations because you need to annotate data in order to identify images inside of video or identify images inside of pictures, especially when they're not in the same background and situation that they may be in your initial data set, which are the pictures of the shoes. And so you're constrained by how much data you can annotate, how well you can identify any given shoe in any given picture. And those are things that you need to put into your feasibility study. All of those constraints, you're either going to have to come up with creative solutions for, where you overcome the problem by, number one, coming up with this really creative solution for labeling or annotation, or on the other side, you begin to focus in on a very small problem statement. You begin to break up that initial every shoe analysis. No, we're only going to analyze the best performing sneakers instead of analyzing all sneakers, going back and trying to do this historical data analysis on just this massive amount of information. So let's start thinking based on that feasibility study about narrowing down which sneakers. Let's probably narrow down brands so that we don't do 100 different brands, because there's literally 100 different brands of sneakers out there that you can find on the secondary market. So maybe let's narrow it down to Nikes, or more specifically Air Jordan shoes. Let's narrow it down to just that. Now when we're doing data ingestion, let's very, very intelligently target specific hashtags so that we're not pulling in the phone book. We're just pulling in maybe two, three, four different hashtags per social media site, so that we don't get the phone book. We don't get this massive data set to analyze because we just don't have the bandwidth, the time, or the resources to do it. Let's think about being very specific about maybe two or three. I mean, if you do Instagram and you do Reddit, you're actually doing a pretty good analysis. There's going to be a lot of data, and it might be the most relevant data. Or maybe you want to do an initial model, like we talked about in the last video, that explores, say for a week, across multiple social media sites and finds the ones with the largest active community. So you do a community analysis around, again, that small number of hashtags to figure out which social media sites have the most engaged sneaker communities, and then just pick the top two or top three around those very specific hashtags, and that's your social media data ingestion. You've narrowed it down. Now your problem space isn't just everything. It's a very small, better defined problem space, and that's based on your feasibility study. Not only understanding more of the dynamics of the marketplace and understanding more of the dynamics of your problem space, but then understanding the limitations and the constraints around the solution. We're talking about reality now. And in every business case, you have some sorts of realities that you have to deal with. This is the real world. We don't have unlimited resources. There is no such thing as unlimited data. And so you have to sort of nod to that. And in your project work, that feasibility study is how you do that. That's how you narrow the scope of your project down. So number one, it's got to be practical for you to actually do in the real world. Like, you have to do this. So you can't have this ridiculously undefined project that'll take you months and months when all you have is a few weeks, and will take you a ton of expensive resources when you don't really have a budget for this. So narrow things down to very specific, very practical, for lack of a better term, objectives. And it's fine to do that. Remember, this is an independent project. You're not expected to do an enterprise project, even though you want something that's very real world and very applied. You still have to make it something that you can do, and that's okay. As a hiring manager, I'm going to look at you paring your project down as a good thing, because that's how things happen in the real world. And it also means that you're mature enough as a data scientist to look at a project with business constraints as well, and to evaluate all the business constraints that you may have and come up with a feasible project, rather than pitching me something that's pie in the sky, where I'm going to shoot hundreds and hundreds of holes in it by saying, look, we can't do that. Look, we don't have access to that data. Look, the API doesn't allow that. Look, that's going to cost a ridiculous amount of money, and you haven't really proven that that extra expenditure is going to result in anything. So that's important to do. Feasibility, exploring the problem space, understanding the domain and the system that you're going to simulate better. Now you have a comprehensive write-up, and it's a very specific set of functional requirements that you are going to implement. So remember, you've got your mapping between your business metrics and your model metrics, and now you've done a feasibility study, and you have a concrete set of requirements for what this has to do, and you've narrowed that set of requirements down to something that you can actually accomplish in the time that you have. So now you start gathering your data. Now you start doing your basic hypothesis creation, where you build your initial model. You begin to understand the dynamics of that model, connect the features, and you're going to be doing a lot of feature engineering, connect the features to your predictions and start finding which ones have high levels of potential correlation. Then build out that initial model as your hypothesis, and then you're ready to test it in the real world. You're ready to go out and watch and make predictions about sneakers and sizes. And then hypothetically, if I followed this investing strategy where I bought these sneakers at regular price and then was able to sell them on the secondary market, say a week or 2 weeks later, what would my returns have been? And you can follow your portfolio and make those trades, simulated obviously, but make those trades and then measure what the outcome is. And if that outcome isn't exactly what you expected it to be, if that initial model based on your training data gave you a level of accuracy that made you think, hypothetically, this should work, now you have something to improve. Now you go back and redo the process, maybe even walk through more of an understanding of the marketplace, look at additional sources of data, try different model architectures, do some different feature engineering, maybe even customize some models, customize portions of models to maximize their functionality against your particular problem space. And you iterate quickly, build that workflow. And this is one of the biggest things I can look for in a project is someone who's iterated and improved their workflow. So from version 1, their workflow is probably going to be immature. But by the time I see iteration 3 or iteration 4, I want to see your workflow having matured. And that's something that you can do very easily because you're going to see the gaps and some of the root cause analysis that you do when you look at, okay, why did this model not perform against the real world like I expected it to? What's broken about my hypothesis? You'll begin to improve your workflow. You'll optimize your pipeline and your data gathering. You'll optimize data discovery. You will automate more and more steps of the model comparison piece, of the feature engineering piece. This is what happens in the real world. This is what we do in business. Improvement isn't just I'm improving the model. It's also I'm making it faster for me to continuously get feedback and then improve the model over time. And that's your workflow. That is optimizing and improving your workflow. It's going to be a huge part of your independent project, is that maturity to say, I started out with this kind of canned workflow and now I'm making it better so that I can iterate faster and faster and faster and continuously improve my model in a less hands-on, more automated way. So that's another huge objective for any project that you take on. And this is sort of a nod to the maintenance phase of your machine learning workflow and creating this continuous feedback loop that allows you to rapidly improve. That's something that we do in the real world all the time. We don't necessarily deploy our first model to production. We'll often run it side by side with whatever it is that's existing in production and see if our model performs better than what's actually running in production right now. What are we using right now to figure out which shoes and what sizes to buy? And you compare model performance to actual, and we don't even deploy the model at that point. And that's how we start validating or refuting our hypothesis, is we do that very simple experiment of running it in the real world and seeing what happens, but in a very similar way to what you're doing with your project, not actually doing the purchasing, just measuring it with this hypothetical. And so you can see now your toy project, your independent project, it's actually pretty similar to what we do in the real world. You've done a lot of the steps and checked a lot of the boxes that we check every day in the work that we do. And so that's going to make your project, your independent project, stand out. As a hiring manager, I'm going to see all of these intangibles, the things that are not technical skills, the things that are capabilities to create valuable work products and drive outcomes for the business. That makes you stand out. That's a huge competitive advantage, because I'd say maybe as many as 90-95% of the independent projects that I look at don't have a strong connection to any sort of business problem or business reality. They're focused on model architecture and they're focused on technology, and everybody has that. Everyone graduates from, as basic as a certification or a boot camp to as advanced as a master's with the ability to use technology and model architectures and a very basic model development workflow to produce something that sounds accurate, but that's not how it's done in the business. And so I need that skills gap covered in your profile, in your portfolio, to show me that you're not just knowledge of all of these tools, but you're capable of the types of work products that drive the outcomes for the business that I'm looking for. And that makes me far more likely to hire you because I have a level of trust in your capabilities rather than looking at your profile and saying, well, I have a hard time figuring out if you can actually do this or if your knowledge is purely academic and you need some more time to figure out what it would take to really do this in the real world. And I've covered in the last 2 videos most of the steps that you need in order to make your project more real world. Like I said, marketplaces are amazing sources of business problems. Just basic research. Remember, you're simulating a system. Just do the basic research to understand the system that you are modeling so that you can create a realistic project with real constraints and you don't run into these things, 2 weeks into your project or 3 weeks into your project. It's terrible to figure out that you can't gather enough data or that you can't access everything that you need. You don't want to find that out later. Find that out early in the planning phase because that's what we do in business. We don't just dive face first into these projects. So make your projects more real world by incorporating the types of elements and background research and understanding of what it takes to push something to production that creates value that makes you stand out. So I highly advise that that is how you tailor your independent projects so that you're far more successful and that you come off as someone who is capable, not just knowledgeable.